In this video, we're going to talk about the basic idea of a rate, and then we're going to talk about crude birth rates. So what is a rate? We'll be using many kinds of rates this semester, so we'll start with a refresher on just the basic idea of rates. Birth rate, death rate, migration rate, what does it mean in a demographic context? At its simplest, it's just the occurrence of an event among a specific population. So a rate of incidence is the number of events that occur during a given time interval over the number of people at risk of the event in a population at that time interval. Usually this is multiplied by a constant so that it's easier to interpret the results. For example, if multiplied by 1,000, you could then say the event occurred 5 times per 1,000 people in the population at risk. A crude rate typically measures an event by the number of times it occurs in comparison to an entire population, regardless of how likely it is that every member of that population would be exposed to the event. So crude death rates, deaths to the mid-year population. Crude birth rates, births to the mid-year population. Why is it called crude? Well, they can only approximately compare more than one population unless they've got a very similar composition. Because they're not taking into account the variations of people who are at risk of the event occurring among that population. So, for example, in a population with 40% over age 65 versus a population with 15% over age 65, which one would probably have more deaths or more births? We get around this issue by using more specific rates, ones that narrow down the population at risk of an event occurring. And in the next video you watch, you'll look at age-specific birth rates, which is just the births to women in an age category to the mid-year population of females that age, and the general fertility rate, which is births to the mid-year population of women of childbearing ages. So think about how these can provide better comparisons between countries over time, etc. So now we're going to head out of PowerPoint and go into Excel so that you can see how to calculate crude birth rates. So we'll start with that. This is the simplest of all the fertility rates we'll be looking at, and the data is usually readily available. In this table, I have Italy's population from this table. I have Italy's population from 1995 to 2010, and the total number of births for each year. The crude birth rate is the number of births divided by the mid-year population times a constant. Usually that constant is 1,000. For those of you who are new to Excel, I'll walk through this very carefully. Excel identifies each thing in the spreadsheet by its row and column locations. You can create formulas by using any mathematical operator plus a whole bunch of predefined functions. In this case, we just need to do some basic math. To start, you tell Excel that you're creating a formula by using an equal sign. This means that what's going into this cell needs to be calculated. Next, I need to tell it that births, here in cell C4, should be divided by population, here in cell B4. But I also need to multiply that result by 1,000. I could just type in times 1,000, but in Excel it's a good idea to get used to using parentheses to separate out the different parts of your formula. Excel doesn't know what the order of operations is, so it just goes left to right. If you needed to do something before it does something else, you need to use parentheses so that that calculation happens first. So I'm going to go ahead and pop a little close parenthesis right there, come on over here and put in my open parentheses, and then come back and do times 1,000, and I hit enter. And there we go. The crude birth rate for Italy in 1995 was 9.17 births per 1,000 population. Now I don't need to redo those formulas. I can simply copy. I'm just going to use Control-C on a Mac. I could do Command-C, or I could use the menu. And then I'm going to highlight in all the cells I want to paste to, and I'll paste. You'll note that Excel moves along down these rows to take into account the change of location of the root data. So there we go. We have our crude birth rate from 1995 to 2010. They don't need to have a lot of decimal levels. You don't have to have, for example, you don't need to have, here we go, we'll go that way. Yeah, that doesn't really add to the level of precision of our understanding of the crude birth rate. So the norm here is to have maybe 1 or 2 decimal levels. Depending on your version of Excel, that might be in your toolbar up here, it might be in one of the other menus, you're looking for how to format a number. For me, because I do this all the time, it actually shows up right here. If it wasn't, I could click on that and it would give me more options. So I'm just reducing this down. I think in this case, I'll go ahead and leave 2 decimal levels so that you can see the fine levels of difference from year to year, since as you can tell, there actually hasn't been a huge amount of variation over time. It's low and it's staying that way, basically. Crude birth rates are easy to calculate and easy to understand, but they have a really big drawback. Since they're based on total population and not the population at risk for giving birth, the crude birth rate is strongly influenced by the age and sex structure of a population. For example, if a population consists of mostly people outside of the reproductive range, their crude birth rates will be lower than that of a population with lots of women in childbearing ages, even if the women in that first country are actually having more children than those in the second country. If a population is getting older over time, and Italy here is a good example, then fertility change over time can be masked by that falling denominator. So we need more refined rates to make comparisons between countries or over time in one country. So we'll move on in the next video to age-specific rates and general fertility rates.